Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome again, and we are going to deal with the section 4th of the rural society in terms of continuity and change. And I think as we know that section 4th is dealing with the changing agrarian structure and the rural developmental concern in rural society. And within that framework, we already had some discussion with regard to how we try to understand the agrarian social structure. We have also discussed about the various initiatives with regard to the rural development, either it is in the form of cooperative societies and also in terms of Panchayati Raj institutions, and also we try to speak about the understanding of rural development. So, I think this is the flow in which we are trying to understand the changing agrarian structure and what are the various rural development initiatives which are going to be quite important. So, here we are going to take up what one can say 17th chapter, that is on green revolution and land reforms in India. I think this is a very significant topic in terms of trying to speak about the rural development in the real sense. It will highlight on the various aspects of green revolution and the various land reform initiatives which are meant towards bringing about the structural transformation and the wider implications of that on the rural society. That is going to be an important issue. So, we have to see at the outset that what is green revolution, and then gradually we will sink down to the history of land reforms, access to the land reforms, common attributes of the land reforms, and we will also try to speak about to some extent the failure of the land reforms in terms of its critique. Friends, somewhere we also try to see that the sort of an understanding with regard to the rural development has to be seen more with regard to the Panchayati Raj institutions in terms of economic political democracy. We have seen the cooperatives in terms of the so called what you can say economic democracy, and now we are trying to speak about the reforms which are to be seen with regard to the agrarian structure in terms of bringing about the development in the production. I think that is the ultimate which has to be seen in terms of the real development, and I think we can sometimes feel that green revolution is a mega project which basically tries to incorporate many things which can be thought of, and sometimes we can say that land reforms can be seen as one important aspect which is going to bring about the sort of structural inequalities to end, and it was more towards the equitable justice and access to the land which was considered to be an important source of earning for the rural India, and that way we try to see that the reforms which has been done with regard to the land in the form of green revolution or land reforms are going to be ultimate. Now, let us try to see what comes into our mind when we try to speak about the green revolution. We try to see that we can have not the full evidences, but we may say that it can run from the early 1940s to 1970s, and although the periodization is bit unsatisfactory, but we try to see that there are various processes of state reconfiguration, capitalist accumulation, concentration of power, we have the agricultural investment, innovations, and which can be called as the green revolution in different senses, and that way we can say that either the green revolution can be seen as one form of land reforms in terms of enhancing the productivity, that is going to be a significant issue, and we also try to see that effectively we try to see the advent of land reforms by 1970s, and the green revolution by itself is seen as a moment in struggles around the creation of values, altering the balance of class forces, reconfiguring the relations to the means of production, and setting the processes of production and reproduction on the new trajectory. And we try to see that what the green revolution is, and the seed of the revolution was planted in the early 1941 when the Rockefeller Foundation sent a team to survey the Mexican agriculture. This resulted in the development of Mexican agricultural program, to which in 1944 a young biologist whose name was Norman Borlaug was hired. As a result of his dedication and ingenuity, he developed the miracle wheat in 1954, which was spread by the Rockefeller and the Ford Foundation throughout the world in 1950s and 1960s with other crops. And we try to see that Norman Borlaug, he won the Nobel Prize for this initiative in 1970s, and soon after we try to see that green revolution can be said to have come to an end. But I think it is not appropriate to say like that. The idea of course is that he has tried his best to make a radical shift in the production system with his initiative, and that was the ultimate in which we try to say that it has come to an end when he received the Nobel Prize. The term green revolution was coined by William Gord, GAUD, William Gord, late in the unfoldings at a meeting of the Society for International Development in DC, Washington DC in 1968, in which he described what has happened as a result of the United States and philanthropic funding for the fertilizers, irrigations improvement and the hybrid seeds. And that is how we try to see the global history of the green revolution which has occurred with regard to the understanding of the green revolution. And to be more specific, quickly let us try to discuss about what is the green revolution in India and how we can see the trajectory of the green revolution in India. So, we try to see that since 1967 when the high yielding variety seeds that is HYVP programs was been launched, it has introduced into the Indian agriculture, and lot many things have been written about the green revolution. And we may not be erroneous to equate the green revolution with the high yield variety program. So, the green revolution has to be understood more as a broader ideology of rural transformation, whereas the programs such as HYVP, integrated rural development programs, and the others are specified for the institutionalized measures for translating the green revolution ideology into the practice. So, I think we try to see that these are certain programs which are meant for what you can say making it more fast. They were acting as a catalyst towards the green revolution. So, it is necessary to emphasize that green revolution was seen as a package, and it was rather a package in terms of an ideology and a program, and it is to be defined as a large scale application of modern science and technology to the agriculture. So, the green revolution technology involves the extensive use of the farm machinery or hybrid seeds, energizing the well irrigation and use of the high fertilizer doses and pesticides and the other issues. And in short, we can say that it is an extensive and intensive use of improved production technology and high yielding variety of seeds, which are seen as an essence of the green revolution. So, though with the differences of degree, the different parts of the rural India have been trying to see the developmental activities, but the initial measures for rural development in the form of community development program which started in 1952, the land reforms, and also we have the cooperative institutions. All of these programs have been initiated from in the first 2 decades, that is from 1947 to 1967 of the independence. And we try to see that these aspects were basically meant for increasing the farm productivity, and also in removing the amount of what I can say rural poverty, unemployment, and also the ever growing socio-economic inequalities in the rural countryside, and that was the basic idea in which these initiatives have been taken. And that way, if you try to see, the green revolution was seen as the US sponsored technological package for agriculture development and was accepted in India somewhat over enthusiastically and also uncritically, because it was seen as bringing a new ray of hope in terms of having the high yield of production. So, it was hoped that with the improved farm production, not only a lasting solution would be found for the perpetual problems of rural poverty and hunger, but it will also generate a new resource base for launching pad for the rural industrialization, and that would create a new employment opportunities and would improve the quality of life at the grassroots. That is going to be important. So, the green revolution, both in terms of theory and practice, has been the dominant and also much talked about in terms of orientation for the rural development programs in India, and that had spread from for nearly 2 decades since 1967. Meanwhile, we try to see that to the mid-term reviews of the net outcome of the green revolution in the countrysides had been attempted two different ways. In early 1970s, within just 5 years of the introduction of high yield variety seeds, and also in the later phase with certain other programs. So, we try to see that it was highlighted that green revolution has both the positive and the negative aspect in terms of the rural development. On the positive side, it was claimed that the impact of green revolution was visible in the food grain production, which has increased in India in the post hybrid variety program period, and by 19.1% over the pre hybrid variety period, that is from 1961 to 65. So, this increase was 87.2% which was found in Punjab and 64.90% in Haryana, where the grains in production performance was very impressive. Hence, some of the scholars believe that to improve the backward regions in general, the agriculture in particular, there was no other alternative to the green revolution. But I think that is not the true story for every part of India. We also try to see that in the similar regions also we have many instances where the negative implications of the green revolution has also been seen. The regional variations in the agrarian social structure in terms of land control and land use patterns, agroclimatic conditions and other socio-cultural as well as the historical specificities can at least be partly accounted for bringing about new forms of inequalities in the rural India, which has also been talked by a few scholars. So, we try to see that the so called green revolution has the mixed results, and we try to see that it is difficult to defend a claim that such an exercise should be seen as value free, because somewhere it involves certain amount of critique which has reflected the negative shades of development. So, we have to be objectively balanced to assess what is right and what is wrong with the green revolution, that is going to be more important. So, we have to see not in terms of quantity alone, rather we have to see the solution more in terms of quality also, and that can be the right way in which we can understand the rural development strategies. So, initially the green revolution measures were considered as a scale neutral. Scale neutral meaning thereby that it will have not have a different implications for large scale farming or the small scale farming. So, it will be scale neutral, and it was therefore expected that whether it is the high yield variety seeds, pesticides, insecticides and fertilizers, or is the question of the lift irrigations, we try to see that it is going to benefit both the small landholders as well as the large landholders, but it did not happen. The agriculture development bureaucracy working at the grassroots, they had the different perceptions. They understand and try to see the notion of scale neutrality, and their action almost reflected that it was pro-rich policy of the rural development. So, we somewhere try to see that the initial understanding of the scale neutrality has been challenged, and it was found that it is basically meant for the pro-rich peasantry only. Like John Mencher, who had spoken with regard to the understanding of the experiences from the Chengalpet district of Tamil Nadu, and he tried to find out that it was far from the neutral. What they thought was needed to further the green revolution was to forget about the small farmers. So, I think somewhere the small farmers has to be neglected off, and it was basically going to give a boost to the rich farmers only. That was one significant thing. That way I think it was trying to create a sort of a divide within the rural India. Also we try to see that the National Seed Project started in India with the World Bank assistance in 1976 as a part of Green Revolution measures, and we try to find out that the production and marketing of the high yield variety seeds were basically meant for production in agriculture. But we try to see that the actual implementation of these schemes which has to be seen with regard to the Green Revolution are also being found critically done. Especially we try to see that the policy underlying the project was to support the expansion of the private sector and to maintain a reasonable balance between the public and the private sector in agriculture. So, I think somewhere Green Revolution was also a tilt towards the so called private sector, and thereby the public sector has to be sidelined. I think this is where we try to see certain faults which have been there with regard to the understanding of the Green Revolution. So, virtually the pro-rich peasant bias of the Indian rural development planning draws its justification from the fallacy that the Green Revolution technology, being capital intensive, suits the rich farmers much better than the small and the marginal farmers, because the rich farmers alone has adequate resources to afford that technology of production, and that expensive inputs are within the reach of only more affluent farmers. Therefore, it is not going to benefit all, rather it is going to have a sectarian approach in terms of its benefits, and this assumption is then developed into an argument that we try to see that it is basically having positive correlations with the farm size. So, higher is the farm size, higher is the benefit with regard to the Green Revolution, and that is how we try to see the negativity of the Green Revolution. We try to see that the rural inequalities which begins to unfold their unnoticed dimensions, and gradually we try to see especially the issue of electricity connections on the agricultural farms, which start enhancing, and suddenly there is a fluctuation in the electricity bills, and more electricity boards were to be seen on the priority basis, and that has basically led to the more utilization of the electricity power. So, virtually we try to see that it has a negative implication in terms of the sustainability with regard to the sustainability of the future generation. That was another important thing that we have to keep in mind. And also when we try to speak about the Green Revolution in terms of mechanization of the farm operation, we try to find out that mechanization is not going to be effective or maybe within the reach of all the farmers. So, virtually the rich farmers could have got the benefits out of the modernization of farm technology, which could not be done by many other peoples, especially when we try to see the misuse of technology in terms of what I can say, having certain amount of victimization in the form of accidents on the farm machines, that also had started happening. And we try to see that in Punjab the Workmen Compensation Act of 1923 was been implemented, but it was not taken seriously in the instances of the so called accidents which are happening because of the use of technology in the rural areas. So, that way I think it has a bearing which has created another nuances in the countrysides, and the health hazards of the rural agricultural labor in the Green Revolution belts are not confined to seeing the research in terms of the machine accidents. We also try to see that we have the use of increasing use of the poisonous chemical sprays for plant protection on the large scales. The high yielding variety of seeds which were being seen as part and parcel of Green Revolution strategies are apparently highly susceptible to the disease, and we try to see that the overuse of the pesticides and the so called germicides have been there, and that has created a new forms of health hazards, and also it has a negative bearing on the agricultural labor. So, that way we try to see that the aspects of land reforms in terms of the Green Revolutions which were being thought of as bringing about the new form of justice to the agriculture in terms of enhancement of the production, that also has carried certain negative implications which are going to be detrimental when we try to see the sort of disasters which are going to come in the future. And that way if you try to see we try to find that it has led to certain amount of prioritization with regard to the green revolution technology package, because ultimately it has created a sort of a divide, which we try to see in terms of the regional divides, the divides within the rural that also has happened, and we also try to see that the poorer has become poorer and the rich has become more rich. So, I think the divide between the rich and poor has been created, and we sometimes has seen that the sort of green revolution has also implemented to some extent the widening of the class dimension, especially we try to see that the rural class has not much what you can say wideness with regard to the disparity, but because of the green revolution I think the disparity has been enhanced, and they have also led to a certain amount of maybe speaking about the new forms of happenings in the form of farmer suicides. Basically we have another important calamity which has happened, the sudden failure of the crops which has the higher investment may ultimately lead to the farmer suicide. So, I think we have to see that how the green revolution has ultimately paid a weight for a new form of development with regard to the rural India. We have many doubts on that particular aspect, especially the scholars like Vandana Shiva who was trying to see things in a very different way and trying to see that green revolution is going to be against the nature, because the hybrid seeds are going to distort the very essence of nature, and that way we have to see that it involves certain amount of blood revolution, because ultimately it is going to play with the nature, and that is where the bigger questions that comes into our mind, and that has been reflected by Vandana Shiva and other scholars, that how green is the green revolution. I think that has to be taken seriously. So, I think this is one important segment that we have to cater to when we try to speak about the rural development, especially in terms of the green revolution, and I think many scholars have worked on this particular issue, and still I think the green revolution is on its peak, and we have to see that how we can have the new forms of positive and the negative implications. Sometimes we try to see that Punjab sometimes has a train which is normally be considered as the cancer patient train, and that is how we try to see the disaster which was not there earlier in the rural has been the part of rural also. So, that way I think we try to see that new forms of hazards are being created because of the green revolution, but I think somewhere we have to see that it should not be seen as a compromise with regard to the development alone. Rather, we have to see that we should adopt a medium path whereby we can have the enhancement in the productivity, but it should not be at the cost of sustainability. But I think beyond that, I think the most prominent issue which we always see and look forward in terms of the rural development and that catches the eyes of any social scientist is the issue of land reform, and definitely that is going to be our second section of the discussion of this particular chapter. And I think when we try to speak about the land reforms, many things comes into our mind, especially the rural sociology basically studies the relations between the landowners, sharecroppers, laborers, and above all the market system where the farm produce is exchanged, and we try to see that the unequal distribution of the land creates the sharp stratification in the society, and on that Gunnar Myrdal has written in the Asian drama that inequality among the individuals is largely a question of land ownership, and the rural income has been functionally related to that land holding. The poor are more likely to be landless than the owning land. So, in a rural society, land is the prime production and which determines the income, employment, status and authority of a person. And in any discussion on rural sociology, the land tenure system and the land reforms, I think they constitutes an important part of the study, and in this sections definitely we are going to take up this particular issue, that is the land reform in India. Now, to begin with, let us try to speak about the history of land reforms, and we try to see that the land constitutes the concurrent list of our Constitution of India, and we also try to find out that various attempts has been made in the history which has basically spoken about the land reforms, even trying to speak about the various peasant movement that we have studied in section 3, where we have spoken about the Tebhaga movement, Telangana movement, or it is the Naxalbari movement. For that sake, we try to see that most of the movements, even the farmers movement, they have certain what you can say concern for the land reforms in either way, and that way we try to see that land reform definitely is going to be an important critical issue when we try to deal with the issue of the rural development. And I think Nehruji always has pronounced that when India will get freedom, land should be justifiably distributed, and that was the major concern. And keeping that particular thing in mind, I think in independent India, the government has decided to abolish the system of Zamindari, Jagidari, in order to remove the intermediaries between the state and the peasant, and that is how we try to see that the first legislation that came almost in all states in the early 1950s is also known as the abolition of the Zamindari Jagidari System Act. And I think the land reforms made on the legislated made by the state government thus had an objective to make justifiable distribution of land and the removal of intermediaries. And what were the basic objectives behind this particular mission was, first of all, to make a redistribution of land to achieve a socialistic pattern of society. I think that was the first important principle of the land reform. And second was to enforce a land ceiling and take away the surplus land to distribute it among the marginal and the landless peasants, so that everybody should have certain control and right over the land. The third thing is to legitimize the agency with the ceiling limits, and that of course is I think going to be crucial, because it will be depending upon the family size, and although it should not bring about certain amount of inequality or unjust with regard to the distribution of the land. We also try to see that to register all the tenancy arrangements within the village panchayat is going to be crucial, and finally to establish the relationship between the ceiling and the tenancy. So, I think these are certain things which has been taken into consideration to see land reforms as an important principle for bringing about reforms in the society. And we basically try to see that the land reforms has been very successful in most of the cases to some extent, and especially we try to speak about the state of Karnataka in 1970s and the West Bengal in 1980s, and even we have the case of Jammu Kashmir, where we have the success of the land redistribution. And we try to see that in the 5-year plan document also we try to acknowledge that reducing inequalities in the land ownership has been the first priority in most of the rural development program, and also in terms of the 5-year plans in the initial phase. So, that way we try to see that what is important is how we are going to pay what you can say or understand the land reforms. Especially we try to see it in terms of access to the land reforms as an important principle for the rural development. And we basically try to see as P.C. Joshi has rightly suggested that there are 3 approaches to the land reform. First of course is the Gandhian approach, second is the radical nationalistic approach, and the third is the Marxist approach. So, I think land reforms can be seen in either of these forms. The Gandhian view does not bring out directly in contradiction to the Indian rural societies, and it is just like what Vinoba Bhave has started a movement known as the Gramdan movement, and this movement approached the landlords to party away with the surplus land based on appeal in the form of donations, and that is how the landless should get the land. So, this is where we try to see that the approach of Gandhian model was been taken up. Second was definitely the radical nationalist, which turned out to be the formal approach to be adopted by the state government and which has been taken care in various states. And lastly, we have the Marxist approach which takes into account which I just shared, that is the formation of the various peasant movement. Like we try to see either it is the Naxalbari movement or the Tebhaga movement, or we try to see certain other movement. Telangana also we have the impressions of the Marxist approach, especially we have the role of CPI, Communist Party of India, which had played a crucial role with regard to bringing about certain amount of justice with regard to the land distribution. So, we try to see that various aspects have been taken into consideration, at least all the three approaches more or less were viable, and they have been having its practicality when we try to see about the land reforms in India, as has been talked about by P.C. Joshi. And then we try to see that what were the common attributes which were required, especially when we try to speak about the land reforms. As I said earlier also, that abolition of the intermediaries, that has been the important concern which has to be taken seriously, and for that I think since we know that before independence the rural India has been seen as having the 4 tenancy system in the country. The first one is the Rohtwari system, second is the Mahalwari system, third is the Zamindari system, and the fourth is the Jagidari system. So, I think if you try to see that sometimes these systems were found in different regions, and sometimes within one state also we try to find that these things were available. So, like we try to speak about the Rohtwari system, this is a kind of land tenancy which was first introduced in British in Madras by British in Madras in 1772, and later on it was extended to the Bombay Presidency. And under this tenancy system, every registered holders of the land was recognized as the proprietor, and he was to pay revenue directly to the government. Then in the Mahalwari, it was seen as a kind of tenancy which was introduced during the British rule, and it was first started in the area of Agra and Awadh, and was later on extended to Punjab. And here the land was held jointly by co-sharing bodies of the village communities, and this body was treated as jointly and severely liable for paying the land revenue. So, the Mahalwari system was there. Then we have the Zamindari system, and this system was basically prevalent in Bengal, Uttar Pradesh, Bombay Presidencies, and in Tamil Nadu. And under this system, one or more person owned the village, and they were responsible for the payment of revenue to the state. And that is how we try to see that Britishers have appointed this system to have the gains from the land, and it was basically seen as one of the most exploitative system, which whereby the absentee landlords have been encouraged, and the actual tillers they were under the fear of ejection from the land, and sometimes the over exploitation of the peasantry has been there because of the Zamindari system. And finally, we have the Jagidari system, and the Jagidari tenancy system was found basically in the princely state of Rajasthan, and we try to see that in Rajasthan the Jagirs were granted to certain military commanders, ministers, and the corps who took the revenue for their own support or for the military force, and which they were obliged to maintain in terms of generating the revenue. So, this is how we try to see that the Jagidari system was created as a class of unproductive mass of people by granting them certain Jagir lands. But however, with the Rajasthan Jagidari Abolition Act, which was passed in 1952 and finally implemented in 1954, we try to see that the Jagidari tenancy system in Rajasthan has ended. So, I think sooner or later after independence, these sort of land revenue systems which were been prevailing in the rural India, especially in terms of what you can say the issue of inequity with regard to the control over the land. So, I think soon after the independence, the government of India has taken serious initiatives to overcome these intermediaries and putting back the peasantry into the mainstream. But as I discussed that beyond that what was required further is also a significant issue of land ceiling. So, I think land ceiling was another important component of the land reforms which was basically required when we try to speak about the reforms with regard to the distribution of the land. So, the basic objective of the land reform was to remove or minimize the unequal distribution of the land. That of course, is the basic motto, and the land ceiling was seen as one important measure to take away the surplus land from those who cross the limits of land possessions beyond a certain point. So, the ceiling limit of land was imposed on the following groups. First was land is a source of income. So, basically we try to see either it is the question of the laborer, marginal farmers or small farmers, they have to be granted certain amount of land. So, the land ceiling limit was applying to these groups who did not have a land, and they should be given certain lands. Second important aspect was the land ceiling should be imposed on variety of lands, especially the fallow land, uncultivable lands, cultivable lands, and the irrigated land. In all these categories of lands, there is requirement for the ceiling. Third, of course, is ceiling on the irrigated and the two crop land. That is another important issue, depending upon the irrigated sources, and also if in one land more than one crops are being sold. So, there also the ceiling has to be different. And then we also try to see that ceiling up to 54 acres, I think that was something which was been standardized consisting of different types of land. So, the total holding after the best categories of land into the lowest category is up to 54 acres. So, I think these are certain things which has been enacted through the Land Ceiling Act, and the basic purpose of the act was that a family of 5 members has been taken as a unit, including the husband, wife and their 3 minor children, and provision has been kept for additional member of the family, but not exceeding twice the ceiling limit. Second was where both the husband and the wife hold the land in their own names, the two will have the right in the properties within the ceiling in proportion to the value of the land in terms of their control. And the third is that each major child is treated as a separate unit for the purpose of application of ceiling. So, I think these are certain things which has been kept in mind, but ceiling limit had certain exemptions, like we try to see that the exemptions were in favor of plantation of tea, coffee, rubber and cocoa, that they were exempted from the ceiling limits. And also we have exemption in terms of industrial and the commercial undertakings, that was also exempted. And also we try to see the exemptions of sugarcane factories are permitted to own land up to 100 acres. So, somewhere we try to see that ceiling limit does not incorporate all the things which are to be cultivated, rather it has to depend upon the nature of land, it has to depend upon the nature of crop, and also on the requirement of the family. And sometimes it has a variation from state to state, like in the state of Andhra Pradesh, the ceiling limit for irrigated land was 10 to 18 acres, and in West Bengal it was 12.4 acres. Similarly, for Haryana it was 17 upon 9 acres, and in Karnataka it was 10.13 acres. So, I think every state have their own geographical viability, and accordingly the ceiling limit has its own variation, but the basic idea of course is that the practice should be made in such a fashion, so that the so called ceiling has to be made comfortable with the people, and they should be in a position to speak about certain amount of reforms with regard to the land, and proper utilization of the land has to take place. So, virtually we try to see that the land possessions and the social power which were seen as an important issue for maintaining the control over the land becomes an important issue, and the agenda of land reform, as we have discussed, was basically for abolition of intermediaries, and the land ceiling was to be implemented effectively. Walter Fernandez has rightly said that an aspect that needs to be borne in mind in order to understand this apparent contradiction is that land is not merely a source of cultivation or building as it is made out of the most legislation. Its ownership pattern in an agrarian economy is a sign of person's social status. I think that is what makes the things more drastic, and we try to see that legitimation of tenancy within the ceiling limit was seen as an important principle to make the things more effective and viable, and it has to be seen in terms of having certain amount of control by the village panchayat, and the village panchayat was been empowered to have the implementation of the land reform legislation and to have the registration of all the tenancy arrangements within the village panchayat domain. And I think we try to see that these initiatives which have been done, they have their own purposes, especially when we try to speak about the land reforms. We try to see that it is not a magical node in which at one go we can have all the reforms. So, I think land reforms have been seen in phases, especially when we try to see the different state. Every state have their own experiences with regard to the implementation of land reforms, and especially we try to also see that in many instances we try to find that there was also the failure of land reforms, and somewhere we have to see that what has resulted into the failure, that becomes an important issue. Basically we try to see that the reforms were basically meant for bringing and bridging the relationship between the man and the land, and between the tillers of the land and the other beneficiaries. That is going to be an important issue. And we basically try to see that the Indian society, which was considered to be heterogeneous in terms of the distribution of land and also in terms of geography, and we have all shades of people in terms of big farmers, sharecroppers, agricultural laborers across the states, and they have their own way of looking to their own interest in terms of agricultural production. So, virtually we try to see that when we try to speak about the land reforms which are to be introduced in an effective way, we try to see that certain flaws has always been there when we try to see its effective implementation, and the reasons can be many, but I think if we just try to map it down in terms of the major reasons which are seen as a critique of the land reforms, why we can say that the tenancy relations and the land reforms legislations have failed. What were the basic what you can say issues which we have to take into consideration. I think first important thing that we have to think seriously is the issue of increasing land inequality. I think that of course is one important thing that makes the things more troublesome, especially when we try to speak about the sort of reforms in terms of distribution of land. We try to say that every state have their own diversity, and we try to also see that the amount of inequality in terms of land ownership across the state was huge, and we try to see that as we have shared earlier that different states have the different mode of revenue system, and that way if we try to see, we try to find out that the state was not in a position, and sometimes they were not willing also in a pressure to have certain amount of equity with regard to the distribution of land, and that way I think somewhere it involves the political will, which is the most essential part to have the effective implementation of the land reforms. So, we try to see that the inequality which has been there across in terms of the big farmers and the small farmers, that has to be taken seriously. We also have to see another important aspect, that is the state was trying to support the big farmers. I think this is bit ironical to say, but somewhere we try to say that the state machinery in terms of bureaucracy, sometimes they were going along with the big farmers and landlords. I think that was another important reasons which has led to the failure of the land reforms in the country, and we try to speak about, and that has been emphasized by NC Saxena in one of his recommendation, that the failure of land reform has been because of the state intervention in support of the big farmers, and that sometimes has led to certain amount of prejudice with regard to the equitable distribution of the justice of land, and where the small farmers have been suffering a lot. Then also we try to see that the big farmer corner the land of marginal farmers. I think this is another drastic thing which has happened. Basically we try to see that smaller patches of the land cannot be operated for agriculture, and what happened of course is, after the land ceiling, the land which was been given to the beneficiaries, to the marginal farmers, they were scattered in nature. Sometimes the quality of land was not proper. So, virtually the big farmers had taken the best at their own end, and the after the land ceiling, the remaining land which was to be distributed was having the various flaws. So, I think that is another important reasons which makes even the distribution of the redistribution of the land not very viable. Similarly, we try to see that surplus land which was been surrendered or which was been identified for distribution, sometimes it was seen as a fallow land or it was an uncultivable land. That was another important tyranny which we try to see is going to be crucial. So, I think that way we try to see that if the poor peasant or the landless peasant, they have got the land, it was barren in nature, sometimes it was not fit for cultivation, and that sometimes was good for nothing, and that is how we try to see that land reform, if it has been done in terms of redistribution, could not have been done very effective. And another important issue that we have to see is basically the issue of Benami transaction. I think Benami transaction was an important phenomenon which was happening, and we try to see that the land possessed in excess of the land ceiling was been adjusted against the Benami person. So, sometimes it was in the name of somebody else, in the name of relatives, or in the name of distant neighborhood, and that is how the land exact land was been hidden, and such Benami transaction do not make any change in the operational aspect of the agriculture, and virtually we try to find out that these Benami transactions were again into the hands of the big landlords, and that way I think the basic purpose of the land reform was defeated, that is to extract the excessive land from the big farmers or big landlords. I think that to some extent was defeated with the process of Benami transaction. And finally, we can say that the lack of political will. I think lack of political will was one important issue, as we have shared earlier, that the political parties who were basically part and parcel of the former Jagidari and Zamindari systems, and they were not in a position to have the quick implementation of the land initiatives, like we try to see that in various states we try to find out that successful cases were being thought of, but the outcome was not very ripe, and we try to see that the states like Andhra Pradesh, Gujarat, Odisha, Madhya Pradesh, Uttar Pradesh and Haryana, they did not have shown much rigorous land reforms. Basically the political will has sometimes been found to be less suitable to care for the needs of the so called marginal and the small farmers. So, that way we try to see that land reforms initiatives which have been there at the different level, I think that is going to be quite significant, but more important is that how or to what extent we are in a position to actually speak about the sort of land distribution, that is going to be an important issue. Like here, for just clarification of an example, if I just try to see take the state of Jammu Kashmir, which somewhere I try to work upon in terms of seeing the amount of land reforms which took place. I think many instances have been there. We try to see that it was considered to be one of the prominent state which has taken away the land, surplus land, and it did not pay the compensation to the land owners. I think this is where we try to see the strength of the land reforms in Jammu Kashmir. But more important is that when we try to see it in terms of its effectiveness, I think because of the geographical location or sometimes because of the sort of trouble in the state because of the governance, sometimes we do not find that the outcome of the land reforms was found very successful. And I think many instances have been there whereby the true what can say owners who were big landlords, or sometimes they were basically having the chunk of lands, I think they could not be controlled because of the land reforms in Jammu Kashmir. Like one important aspect was that orchards, especially in the Kashmir, the orchards basically the apple orchards and the fruit orchards which have been there, I think they were beyond the control over the land reforms. So, many people they have showed their land as the orchards, and I think these were the peoples who were basically having I think multiple lands, and they had a huge amount of surplus lands, but because in the name of the orchard sometimes they have been excused from donating or surrendering their land, and that is where we sometimes find out that the basic purpose of land reform was to bridge the inequality which has been there with regard to the land holding. I think that could not be sustained, and that is where we try to see that certain flaws has been created. And also we try to find out that many times it was been found that in certain instances like Operation Barga in West Bengal, that was again considered to be one of the successful case. Similarly, like Karnataka also was seen as one of the successful state in terms of land reforms. So, I think many measures have been there to bring about the sort of reforms with regard to the distribution of the land. On an average, if you try to see the basic outcome in terms of the reforms, we try to find out that the attempt was basically meant for initially meant for having the abolition of intermediaries. That was one significant thing which has been highlighted across the state. In most of the state, I think land reform was being done by removing the intermediaries. That was one important thing. Second, which we can say is the implementation of the Sealing Act. I think the implementation of the Sealing Act was another important thing which we have to take it seriously, and that was one important way in which the land reforms were being implemented in various states. And the third thing in that sense, if you try to see, somewhere we try to find out that the third important thing was basically to see that the surplus land has to be distributed to the so called what you can say marginal farmers and the landless peasantry. So, I think that was one initiative which was been made, but ultimately we try to see that these sort of initiatives which has been done across the state, they were not uniform in nature, and I think as we shared that sometimes the parameters on which we try to say that the critiques had been raised that why land reforms have been failure on various grounds. So, I think across the states there are different reasons which has motivated for not implementing the successful land reforms. So, I think these are certain things that we have to keep in mind, but I think the story of the land reform should not stop here. I think as we can share which we try to speak in the earlier phase of this deliberation, that green revolution definitely is an important tool, and that way we can say that one aspect of land reform can be the green revolution, because green revolution also is one form of land reform that we have to see, because ultimately it is also going to enhance the productivity, the quality of land has to be enhanced. So, I think that can be seen as one important way in which the land reform has to be seen, and I think the basic idea which we have to keep in mind of course is that the successful green revolution definitely can pave a way for the effective productivity, and that is another important component of land reform to enhance the productivity of crops. And then I think now we can see another shade of land reforms which is happening, especially when we try to speak about the sort of consolidation of land. I think that is going to be an important issue, that consolidation of land has to take place in order to make the effective use of the land. And beyond that, I think certain other things which are basically being done and are being required to be taken are like we are now speaking about the digitalization of the land. Now, the digitalization and computerization of the land records that are being done by various states. Again, I think Karnataka definitely has played a crucial role with regard to maintaining the digitalization of the land records, and I think NIC that way is doing an effective way to have all the land records into the computerized form. And I think this is one way in which we can have certain control over the land in terms of who is the owner, how much is the land, and everything can be assessed at any corner of the country. And that is, I think, another successful way in which we have to see that land reform initiatives has to be taken. And then I think if we have to really go further, I think what is required in that sense, of course, is certain land reform initiatives has to be seen in terms of having certain amount of cooperatives with regard to the land. I think that is another important issue which we have to take up seriously, especially when we try to speak about the land reforms with regard to having certain amount of common ventures. I think that is going to be another important issue. Further, I think land reforms has to be seen in terms of the effective use of that land which is normally considered as the wasteland. I am basically referring to the land which is not arable, which is not utilized. I think they have to be taken into consideration, especially the lands which are with regard to the tribals, the tribal population which is unable to utilize the effective land. I think that is the way in which we can have further land reforms by having the justifiable access to the land resources, especially the proper use of the land, that is going to be more important. So, I think the basic principle which is involved for the land reform involves a certain amount of equity with regard to the land, that is going to be an important issue, but more than that, what is important is that how it has to be successfully implemented, and that is where I think the crux of the rural development lies, because land for all practical reason is going to be very sound in terms of not only as an economic source, but it is also seen as a status symbol for many, and that is how we have to see that if we have the proper distribution of the land in an effective way, we can actually speak about the proper utilization of the land. So, friends, I think these are certain things that we have to keep in mind, and I think plenty of material are available when we try to speak on the issue of green revolution. We can speak about the green revolution, as I have suggested earlier. We can have the contribution by D. N. Dhanagre, that is going to be an important issue. He has worked on agrarian reforms and the rural development in India, that is going to be quite significant. Many economists has worked on the green revolution, like G. S. Bhalla and G. K. Chadda, who had worked extensively on the green revolution and the small peasants. Then also we try to speak about the contribution of Vanda Shiva, who tries to see the green revolution in a very different framework, and now we are trying to see the critique of the green revolution. And since most of our discussion is based on the readings of these works, and that way we try to see that how we can have the better understanding about the green revolution from the recent resources. We have a wonderful work which can be seen by Patel, who has extensively worked on the modern, postmodern understanding about the green revolution, and that way we say that Patel Raj, I think Raj Patel has significantly worked upon this particular issue, and that also has to be taken into consideration when we try to see the effect of green revolution across the world. And these are, I think, certain ways in which we can equip ourselves for better understanding about the rural development with regard to the green revolution. And on the issue of land reforms, I think one sizable thing which is always available is, I think the SAGE has come out with the volumes on land reforms in India, and it is basically divided into 12 volumes which tries to cover up, I think I will not say the entire states, but majority of the states are been covered, and that is basically a mega what you can say project and survey which has been done by Lal Bahadur Shastri Institute, Mussoorie. And that way I think lot many bureaucrats and the academicians are involved with regard to finding out the effective measures which have been taken for land reforms across the states. So, I think that is a handy volume that one has to read, and beyond that I think the contribution by P. C. Joshi on land reforms in India, and then we have, I think, D. R. Gadgil and many other scholars who have extensively worked on. P. S. Appu's contribution is on land reforms in India. S. C. Dubey has worked extensively on that. We have the contribution of A. R. Desai, his sizable volume on the rural sociology in India. I think extensive literature is available, and of recent I think Paramjit Singh Judge has worked with regard to land reforms in the state of Punjab. So, I think we try to see across the states, we have specific case studies which tries to speak about the land reforms in general, and that is the way in which we have to effectively understand and relate it with the updated knowledge about the land reforms. So, friends, I think these are the things which I wanted to share. The basic idea definitely is to promote and inculcate in your minds that how and in what forms the rural society has been transformed. What is required at your end, of course, is you have to update your knowledge about these issues to make it more effective, and that is the way in which the purpose of this course has to be resolved in terms of having the effective knowledge about our grassroots society. And this is where we have to really learn ourselves, and we have to unlearn what is happening, the ground experiences that we have to tap, and on the basis of that we have to have the further readings about the rural society. So, I think that is all for the discussion on this topic on green revolution and land reforms, and I think we will meet on other lectures on the contemporary issues with regard to the land reforms initiatives, as well as with regard to the green revolution in general, and of course, trying to speak about the rural development in India. Thank you once again.